In this episode, we are moving into a practical framework that helps turn broad AI concerns into organized governance work. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, created the Artificial Intelligence Risk Management Framework, AIRMF, as a way to help organizations think about risk, trustworthiness, and accountability across the life of an AI system. For a brand new learner, that matters because governance can sound vague until you have a structure that tells you what to examine, what to document, and how different decisions connect. The value of the playbook is that it takes that structure and makes it easier to use in the real world by offering suggested actions that support the framework's outcomes. If you remember nothing else at the start, remember this. The framework gives you the organizing logic, and the playbook helps you turn that logic into habits, evidence, and repeatable governance practice. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. One of the first things to understand is that the NIST AIRMF is not a law, not a certification exam by itself, and not a rigid technical recipe. It is a voluntary governance resource designed to help organizations of different sizes and sectors manage the many kinds of risk that can come with AI systems. That means it can be used by a hospital, a school, a software company, a financial institution, a government agency, or a small internal business team, even though all of those environments have very different missions and constraints. This flexibility is one reason the framework is so important in governance education. Rather than assuming one universal checklist can solve every problem, it gives organizations a shared way to reason about risk while still adjusting to their own use cases, priorities, resources, and legal obligations. For a beginner, this is a powerful lesson because it teaches that strong governance is not about memorizing one fixed process, but about using a stable framework to make better judgments in context. That context matters because AI risks are not limited to the classic security problems many people think of first. A system can be technically secure and still create serious governance trouble if it produces unreliable outputs, reinforces unfair patterns, undermines privacy, confuses users, or encourages people to trust it in situations where it should only play a supporting role. This is one reason the AIRMF is broader than a traditional information security framework. It asks you to think not only about whether a system can be attacked, but also whether it is fit for its purpose, whether it behaves in a trustworthy way, and whether people affected by it are being put at unreasonable risk. That broader lens is essential in AI governance because the harms can be social, legal, operational, ethical, and reputational all at once. A student who understands that broader risk picture is already in a stronger position to use the framework well, because the framework is designed to manage more than purely technical failure. The core of the framework is built around 4 functions: govern, map, measure, and manage. These 4 functions are not random labels, and they are not meant to be followed as a simple one-direction sequence that ends once a project launches. Govern sits across the entire life cycle because governance decisions shape everything else, from ownership and policy to documentation, review, escalation, and accountability. Map is about understanding context, purpose, stakeholders, and the specific conditions in which the AI system will operate. Measure is about testing, analysis, and evaluation so the organization can learn what risks exist, how serious they are, and where claims about performance or trustworthiness may be weak. Manage is about prioritizing and acting on what was learned so that risks are treated, monitored, and revisited over time instead of being written down once and forgotten. When beginners first hear these 4 functions together, they are really hearing the backbone of a disciplined governance program. Govern is often the hardest function to appreciate at first because it can sound more abstract than testing or monitoring. Yet it is the function that makes the rest of the framework workable. In practice, govern asks whether the organization has clear roles, decision rights, policies, risk tolerance, review procedures, escalation paths, documentation habits, and accountability mechanisms for AI. It also asks whether leadership is serious about creating a culture where concerns can be raised and examined before they become incidents. A governance structure built on the AIGP therefore begins with assigning ownership instead of leaving everyone to assume someone else is in charge. Someone needs to own policy. Someone needs to own model or system review. Someone needs to own testing standards. Someone needs to own deployment approval. And someone needs to own monitoring and incident response. Without that operating structure, organizations often convince themselves they are governing AI when they are really just hoping that informal coordination will be enough. MAP is where the framework forces a team to stop speaking in broad slogans and start defining what the system actually is and why it exists. A useful governance program cannot begin with a vague statement that the organization wants to use AI to improve efficiency. It has to identify the use case, the intended purpose, the people affected, the decisions influenced, the data involved, the setting in which the system will be used, and the kinds of harms that are plausible in that setting. Mapping also means understanding where the system fits in a larger workflow rather than pretending the model exists in isolation. A recommendation model inside a school support tool, a summarization model inside a legal review process, and a chatbot answering customer questions may all use similar technology while creating very different governance needs. The map function gives structure to that thinking by making context visible, and that is critical because a system cannot be governed responsibly if nobody has clearly described the context in which it is supposed to operate. Measure is the point where governance becomes evidence-based rather than assumption-based. A team may believe a system is accurate, fair, robust, understandable, or safe enough, but the measure function asks how the team knows that and whether the evidence is good enough for the actual use case. This function includes testing, analysis, and evaluation across technical performance, as well as broader trustworthiness concerns. In many organizations, this is where the term test, evaluation, validation, and verification, TEVV, becomes especially important because it reminds teams that checking an AI system is not one single activity and not one single benchmark score. The organization may need to measure error patterns, performance across groups, resilience under unusual inputs, user comprehension, human oversight effectiveness, or how often the system behaves poorly outside laboratory conditions. A major governance lesson for beginners is that measurement is not there to prove the project is good. It is there to reveal where confidence is justified, where it is weak, and what still needs attention before and after deployment. Manage is the function that turns all of that learning into action. Once a team has identified use case context and gathered evidence about risks, it still has to decide what to do, which risks are acceptable, which ones require mitigation, which ones require redesign, and which ones should stop a deployment altogether. This is where governance becomes visible in decisions about approvals, limitations, human review requirements, fallback procedures, monitoring plans, change control, and incident response. Manage is also where the framework reminds organizations that risk treatment is not just about prevention. Some risks must be reduced through design, some must be constrained through process, some must be watched over time, and some may require the organization to walk away from a use case that is not mature enough to govern well. A beginner-friendly way to think about this function is that it closes the loop. Governance is not complete when a risk is named. Governance is complete only when the organization has acted on that risk in a way that can be explained, defended, and maintained. The companion playbook is what makes the framework easier to use operationally, especially for teams that understand the four functions in theory but are unsure how to translate them into day-to-day governance work. The playbook provides suggested actions aligned to the subcategories within govern, map, measure, and manage. That means it does not replace the framework, and it is not a second, competing model. Instead, it acts like a guide that helps organizations explore practical ways to achieve the framework's outcomes. One of the most important lessons here is that the playbook is not a checklist and not a strict sequence of steps that must be completed in full every time. That matters because governance fails when organizations turn guidance into thoughtless compliance theater. The playbook is most useful when it helps a team ask better questions, document decisions more clearly, and select the actions that fit the actual system, use case, risk tolerance, and operating environment. Using the playbook will usually means translating its suggestions into governance artifacts and routines that people can actually maintain. An organization might use it to shape intake questionnaires for proposed AI use cases, review templates for high-risk projects, model or system inventories, documentation expectations, approval gates, testing plans, incident workflows, or monitoring dashboards. The goal is not to produce more paperwork for its own sake. The goal is to ensure that important questions are asked consistently and that evidence can be found later when leaders, auditors, legal teams, or affected stakeholders want to understand what happened. For example, the Playbook can help a team define how to capture system purpose, data sources, assumptions, limitations, affected stakeholders, performance measures, and post-deployment triggers for review. Once that information is built into governance routines, the framework stops being a reference document on a shelf and becomes part of how the organization actually governs AI in practice. Another important feature of the AI RMF is the idea of tailoring, because not every organization or use case should be governed in exactly the same way. The framework supports profiles, which are ways of applying the functions, categories, and subcategories to a particular setting, technology, or risk environment. This matters because a general productivity assistant, a medical decision support tool, and a generative content system do not create the same governance needs. A team can use profiles to decide which risks need the most attention, which measurements matter most, which control points are essential, and what level of documentation or review is appropriate. That tailoring process is not a loophole to weaken governance. It is the way governance becomes practical and honest. Beginners should hear this clearly. A strong framework is not one that forces identical controls everywhere, but one that helps organizations apply the right level of discipline to the right kind of system without pretending all AI systems are equally risky or equally mature. The framework is also valuable because it brings human roles back into a conversation that sometimes becomes too focused on the model itself. Good governance under the AI RMF is not just about what the technology can do. It is about what people around the technology are expected to do, understand, challenge, approve, monitor, and change. That means governance should include attention to training, human oversight, communication, escalation, and accountability across the full lifecycle. A technically sophisticated team can still fail badly if nobody is responsible for questioning misuse, if decision-makers do not understand system limitations, or if no one reviews how the system performs after deployment. The framework, therefore, helps organizations see governance as a human and organizational system, not just a technical one. This is especially important for new learners because it counters a common misconception that the best governance program is simply the one with the most advanced model evaluation tools. Tools matter, but people, roles, and operating discipline matter just as much. Several common mistakes become easier to avoid once you understand how the framework and playbook are meant to work together. One mistake is treating the framework as if it were only for large enterprises with formal risk offices, when in reality, even a small team can benefit from clearer ownership, better mapping of use cases, more disciplined testing, and stronger decision records. Another mistake is using the playbook as a box-checking exercise instead of as a thinking aid. A third mistake is focusing only on the measure function because testing feels concrete while ignoring govern and map, which often determine whether the right questions were asked in the first place. A fourth mistake is assuming governance ends at launch, even though the AI RMF clearly supports ongoing monitoring, reevaluation, and adaptation. These mistakes are common because teams are often under pressure to deploy quickly. The framework helps slow the thinking down just enough to make the deployment more defensible, more responsible, and often more sustainable. A simple example can show how this all comes together. Imagine a college wants to use an AI assistant to help triage student support requests and identify messages that may need urgent attention. A weak governance approach would focus only on whether the model classifies messages quickly and whether the interface looks polished. A stronger AI or MF-based approach would begin with govern by assigning ownership, defining oversight, setting documentation expectations, and deciding how risk decisions will be reviewed. It would then map the context by asking what kinds of student messages are in scope, what harms could occur if urgent cases are missed, how students might be affected by false positives or false negatives, and how the tool fits into the human support workflow. It would measure performance and risk through meaningful evaluation, not just one accuracy number, and then manage by choosing thresholds, fallback rules, escalation steps, monitoring plans, and a schedule for re-evaluating the system after real-world use begins. What makes the NIST AI RMF so useful for governance education is that it teaches you to structure decisions before those decisions turn into conflicts, incidents, or regulatory problems. It encourages organizations to think in terms of life cycle, evidence, human roles, context, and continuous improvement rather than in terms of a single approval moment. The Playbook strengthens that approach by offering concrete suggestions that teams can adapt into repeatable processes and governance artifacts. For the AIGP exam, the real takeaway is not just that you can name, govern, map, measure, and manage. The deeper takeaway is that you understand how those functions help build a governance program that is organized, explainable, and durable under pressure. When you can hear the framework that way, you stop seeing governance as vague oversight language and start seeing it as a structured operating model for making better AI decisions over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.